Good day all. This talk will examine the criminal justice system's policy of a war on drugs. In order to complement the theories presented in my other talks, this talk will primarily take a historical approach. It will examine the origins, implementation, and consequences of the war on drugs as they have unfolded historically. The history of drug use is much older than the history of the war on drugs. From time immemorial, people all over the world have used psychoactive drugs for medical, recreational, and even religious purposes. For example, opium poppies were cultivated in Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago. There were no laws against their use anywhere in the world until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The criminalization of drugs, or the war on drugs, began with North American doctors. This probably surprises nobody. After all, it is the job of medical practitioners to alert the public to any health risks, such as dangerous drugs. However, a closer look at history suggests that the doctors' motives were not so pure. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, doctors struggled to make a living. This is because most people would only go to a doctor as an absolute last resort. And this in turn is because most of the things that doctors did back then were both painful and ineffective. Widespread techniques like bleeding, blistering, and purging did far more harm than good. Surgery was both lacking in anesthesia until the 1850s and lacking in antiseptic techniques until the 1880s. As a result, until the very end of the 19th century, most people who went under the knife died on the table or of post-operative infection. People were so reluctant to go to a surgeon or so-called sawbones that most surgeons were also barbers and made more money from cutting hair than from their medical practice. In North America, these doctors who had immigrated from Europe also faced competition from indigenous healthcare practitioners. Native peoples had medicine women who knew how to make herbal medicine. Herbal medicines are not as powerful or fast-acting as the chemical medicines invented in the 20th century, but they do work. People wouldn't have used them for thousands of years if they didn't. The medicine women offered health care that was not painful, not invasive, and much more effective than conventional medicine. Not surprisingly, European doctors were losing this competition. So, all across North America, in Canada, the US, and Mexico, the 18th and 19th centuries saw doctors organize and put pressure on governments to pass laws granting them a legal monopoly on the rights to practice medicine and to prescribe medicines. These laws were eventually passed, and these days we accept as natural that you have to have a medical license to legally practice or prescribe medicine. But when the laws were first passed, they were not popular with the general public. Most people would rather go to the medicine woman for herbal medicine than to a doctor who might apply leeches to suck the supposed excess blood out of them. In Mexico, one of the most widely used herbal medicines was medical marijuana. So, the doctors pressured the Mexican government to criminalize the use of marijuana, which it began to do in the 1880s with full prohibition coming in 1920. In other words, the war on drugs began in 19th century Mexico as a war on medical marijuana. The doctor's motivation in starting it was not concern for the public health, but a desire to eliminate their competition by having anyone who prescribed or used marijuana officially labeled as a criminal. The doctors achieved their goal by putting together an organized propaganda campaign. They claimed that marijuana was extremely dangerous and could have all manner of harmful effects: sterility, madness, even death. All of these claims were quite literally made up out of thin air. Scientific evidence for them was neither available nor wanted. The doctors just attributed to marijuana all the worst effects that they could think of. And so, the war on drugs was, from its very beginning, based on a tissue of lies. In the early 20th century, particularly after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, large numbers of Mexicans began to migrate to the US, both legally and illegally, in search of jobs. They formed a pool of cheap labor, which American businesses could employ at low wages, and still do. These Mexicans introduced marijuana into the US, and its use swiftly spread to the general US population. This alarmed American politicians so much that beginning in 1937, they passed laws first taxing, then criminalizing marijuana, thereby bringing the war on drugs to the US. The anti-marijuana material written by Mexican doctors was translated into English and accepted as gospel truth, despite having no factual basis. It was accepted because it was in the interest of American doctors, politicians, and businesses to accept it. Marijuana provided Mexicans with a potential alternative source of income. They wouldn't have to be cheap manual labor if they could make much more money selling weed. Businesses did not want to lose that cheap labor. Marijuana would even make some Mexicans rich, and if that happened, well, then some of them would enter politics and displace the white male politicians who monopolized American politics back then. So, politicians, like doctors, got rid of their potential competition by criminalizing marijuana. The war on marijuana gained explicitly racist overtones in the US. Police officers in the southern US were cited in the press declaring that, quote, inferior races, such as, quote, our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents, were given a, quote, lust for blood by marijuana, which touched off uncontrollable violence and even homicidal mania in them. Today, marijuana is known for promoting mellowness and relaxation, the exact opposite of this supposed violent behavior. But at the time, many people believed such claims. White Americans' fear of Mexicans was conflated with fear of Mexican so-called loco weed to orchestrate a fear campaign to promote public support for the criminalization of marijuana. Crazy Mexicans on drugs were the convenient boogeyman used by white US politicians in the early 20th century to boost their power. A century later, echoes of this racist fear campaign were used by Donald Trump with his proposal to build a wall between Mexico and the US. The criminalization of marijuana in the US was accomplished in a completely top-down manner. There was no public outcry in the early 20th century demanding the criminalization of marijuana or any other drug. Indeed, most Americans had still had little contact with such drugs and neither knew nor cared much about them. Rather, the US federal government created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which then mounted an anti-marijuana campaign based on that of the Mexican doctors and supported by American police. This campaign was taken up by some sectors of the US entertainment industry. For example, 1936 saw the release of the infamous film Reefer Madness, which portrayed marijuana as causing a descent into not only madness, but also crime and violence caused by the loco weed. This movie was so badly made that it's become an unintentional satire. The evils attributed to marijuana are so wildly exaggerated that today they're funny. However, at the time, the general public knew so little about marijuana that many believed in reefer madness. More recent portrayals of drug use in the media have become more sophisticated, but the basic message that drugs are bad has been put out by countless movies and TV shows, especially those made in Hollywood. The war on drugs has provided Hollywood with a very profitable storyline, which has been used over and over. Police versus drug dealers, good guys versus bad guys. But the early push for the criminalization of marijuana came from a media mogul who benefited from it much more directly, William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was a newspaper publisher who in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was one of the most influential men in America. His life provided the basis for the famous movie Citizen Kane, and he is often credited with pushing the US into the Spanish-American War of 1898 just to increase his newspaper circulation. He also helped to push the US into the war on drugs, because he was one of the driving forces behind the introduction of anti-marijuana legislation. He did this because he also owned lumber companies to supply pulp and paper for his newspapers. The value of those companies would have plummeted if the US had started growing hemp to make into paper. Hemp grows far more quickly than trees and is much cheaper. So in both economic and ecological terms, the US would have been better off if it had begun making most of its paper from hemp over a century ago. That it did not do so is largely due to Hearst's efforts. Hearst launched an anti-marijuana campaign in his papers, promoting legislation which included a ban on hemp production. Once more we see that the war on drugs had nothing to do with promoting public safety and everything to do with increasing profits. In Canada, a very similar scenario to that in the US played itself out, except with a different ethnic group and a different drug. In the late 19th century, large numbers of Chinese immigrants came to Canada, primarily to provide cheap manual labor building Canada's railroads. Once the railroads were built, the government enacted various measures to deter further Chinese immigration and to keep those who were already here in their position as cheap manual laborers and no more. These measures included the 1908 Opium Act, which began the war on drugs in Canada. In China, the use of recreational opium was legal and widespread, and spreading this practice to North America would provide Chinese immigrants with a major alternative source of income. As in the US, this threatened the interests of both businesses and politicians, so they united against it. The Opium Act, first and foremost, prohibited the importation of opium into Canada rather than its use. Its goal was to sever the supply chain from China to Canada, not to protect the public health. In 1923, the act was expanded and penalties were made tougher. Among other things, Chinese persons caught using or selling opium could now be deported back to China. This deportation order only applied to Chinese immigrants. Just as in the US, the so-called drug menace was linked to a specific non-white ethnic minority who could then be portrayed as a danger to white society, the yellow peril. In this way, racism was put to the service of the war on drugs. In short, the war on drugs began because white doctors in Mexico wanted a monopoly on prescribing drugs, and continued because of racism and economic and political opportunism in Canada and the US. None of this early legislation was based on any scientific research whatsoever into the health impact of psychoactive drugs. In the past, for thousands of years, pre-industrial societies made psychoactive drugs out of whatever plants grew in their region of the world. Marijuana, hashish, opium poppies, coca leaves, the peyote cactus, and so on. For the most part, they were simply dried and ingested. However, modern industrial society has processed these plants. Their active ingredients have been concentrated and made more potent. Problem with this is that more potent also means more dangerous. The greater the effect, the greater the potential for harmful side effects. This is why, whether we're talking about food or drugs, the more natural it is, the healthier it is. The more processed it is, the unhealthier it is. The late 19th century saw the invention of processed drugs. Opium was turned into heroin in the 1870s, and coca leaves were turned into cocaine in the 1890s. Both were initially regulated in the US in 1914, then criminalized in the 1920s. In the campaign to criminalize cocaine, the race card was played once more. African Americans were said to be more susceptible to the effects of the drug, which supposedly drove them into a violent frenzy. Although there is no scientific evidence for this, reports of black cocaine fiends circulated alongside those of Mexicans on loco weed to scare the white population into supporting the war on drugs. Despite this, cocaine remains the second most popular illegal recreational drug in the US, behind marijuana. Heroin could not be connected to a non-white ethnic minority. It was invented in England and popularized by the German pharmaceutical company Bayer, which marketed it from 1895 onwards primarily as an over-the-counter cough suppressant. Despite Bayer's initial claims that it was non-addictive, mounting evidence of its addictive nature led to its fairly swift regulation and then criminalization. The war on drugs was expanded massively by US President Richard Nixon in the 1970s. Nixon's problem in doing so was that he'd lost the support of much of the medical establishment. On the one hand, doctors now had effective chemical medicines and so no longer feared competition from herbal medicines, including medical marijuana. And on the other hand, despite being hampered by the law, some genuine scientific research on the health impact of illegal drugs was finally done. The results of this research were collected in a lengthy report, which was published by the Office of the US Surgeon General and delivered directly to President Nixon. The report said that the harmful effects of illegal drugs, particularly marijuana, had been either made up or wildly exaggerated in earlier writings. The Surgeon General recommended the immediate decriminalization of most illegal drugs, especially marijuana, which was and is by far the most widely used recreational drug. Nixon knew that this was what the report said, and it wasn't what he wanted to hear. So, in what has become a famous historical scene, he picked the report up off his desk and dumped it in the trash can unread. This was, of course, not the first or the last time that a politician ignored scientific facts because they didn't fit into his political agenda. Nixon's agenda was to use the war on drugs as a pretext to increase his power and the power of the criminal justice system. Nixon's administration put unprecedented numbers of Americans into prison on drug-related charges. It is ironic that this law and order president ultimately had to tell the world, "I am not a crook," and have nobody believe him. Nixon expanded the Bureau of Narcotics into the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, in 1973. Through this body, Nixon greatly increased the scope and the budget of the war on drugs. And while Nixon is now long gone, the DEA has only continued to grow. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan expanded the war on drugs again, introducing mandatory sentencing and longer jail terms for drug-related offenses. Hiding behind Nancy Reagan's famous "Just Say No" campaign was another major jump in drug-related incarcerations. This increase in the US's prison population dovetailed nicely with Reagan's program of prison privatization. The more people Reagan could put in prison for drugs, the greater the profits for the private prison corporations he supported. Today, the DEA has offices in over 70 countries, employs over 10,000 people, and has a budget of over $3 billion a year. It is responsible for arresting well over 1 million Americans each year for drug possession and close to 250,000 for drug dealing. As a result, there are currently close to 500,000 people in American jails on drug-related charges, making up about 20% of the US's total prison population, with over 1 million more on probation or parole. Despite this massive program of incarceration, the DEA intercepts less than 1% of the drugs that enter the US and has had no appreciable impact on the availability of these drugs. For example, today the US remains by far the world's largest consumer of cocaine, most of it imported. Globally, the war on drugs has failed to eradicate or even diminish recreational drug usage. Today, it is estimated that worldwide, over 150 million people regularly use marijuana, over 20 million use cocaine, and close to 20 million use opiates, most commonly heroin. Altogether, globally, over 200 million people use illegal drugs on a regular basis. Multiple studies have shown that criminalization of drugs has not reduced their use, and conversely, that decriminalization has not increased their use. This is because, despite the war on drugs, anyone who wishes to obtain psychoactive drugs can already do so. As widespread use of marijuana led to widespread disbelief in the health risks being officially claimed for it, the war on drugs shifted its focus to the dangers of heroin. Through the latter half of the 20th century, heroin was presented in the media as the most dangerous drug available. Statistics were provided showing a steadily mounting death toll from heroin overdoses. Globally, it is currently estimated that heroin overdoses cause over 100,000 deaths each year. However, these statistics are misleading. They've been used to justify the war on drugs, but I would argue that most of them have been caused by the war on drugs. Heroin is not actually that easy to accidentally overdose on. People have been known to take over 10 times the regular dose without any immediate harm. Overdoses happen because the potency of the heroin that people consume from street dealers varies enormously. So, a quantity which was safe to consume one week can be fatal the next week. Moreover, most so-called heroin overdoses are no such thing. Street dealers often increase their profits by cutting the heroin with any convenient white powder, pancake makeup, icing sugar, cornstarch, and so on. When those substances are injected into a person's veins and reach the heart, they clog the heart and cause a heart attack. But these people have not been killed by the drugs. They've been killed by the war on drugs. Because if those drugs had been bought legally in a pharmacy, the way that many far more dangerous drugs are, those overdoses or so-called overdoses would not have happened. Fentanyl was invented in 1960 as a synthetic opioid about 50 times as strong as heroin, and was used in a variety of medical applications. But in the 2010s, fentanyl made its appearance on the streets and swiftly took over from heroin as the most dangerous drug. By 2018, there were over 4,000 fentanyl overdoses in Canada and over 20,000 in the US. The main problem with fentanyl is that it is so concentrated that as little as 2 milligrams can be fatal. So it's very easy to accidentally overdose, especially when, as with heroin, the user cannot be sure of the potency of drugs bought on the street. As with heroin, these deaths have been caused not by the drugs, but by the war on drugs. If those drug users had been able to buy their fentanyl legally in a pharmacy with the pills in proper doses, none of those deaths would have happened. This is why criminalizing hard drugs has ended far more lives than it has saved. Illegal drugs, so we've been told, are such a massive health risk that governments the world over have spent billions of dollars in attempting to prohibit them through the policy known as the war on drugs. Even though the similar attempt to prohibit alcohol in the 1920s was a complete failure, which only increased the profits of criminals, and even though close to a century of this policy has not reduced the availability or use of these drugs in the slightest, most governments continue to adhere to it. The implication of this policy is that the danger and the allure of these drugs is so great that the individual cannot be trusted to make their own decisions regarding their use, but that their government must make the decision for them and simply make these drugs unavailable. The problem with this is that, as we've seen, governments have wildly exaggerated the health risks of most illegal drugs. As I said, the US Surgeon General's office concluded way back in the 60s that the health risks of marijuana in particular had been greatly exaggerated, and a similar report issued by the Canadian Medical Association in the 80s concluded that for adults, the health risks of marijuana are, quote, minimal, unquote. In the 21st century, as serious scientific research into medical marijuana has become possible, it's been found that, as medicine women knew for thousands of years, its health benefits far outweigh its minor health risks. For example, while the anti-marijuana campaign has argued that since it's like tobacco, marijuana causes cancer, tests have found that it actually shrinks tumors in lab mice. It's also been found effective in the treatment of illnesses, including epilepsy, glaucoma, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, psoriasis, and more general ailments like pain, nausea, anxiety, and of course, loss of appetite. Moreover, even if drug users are doing some long-term harm to their own health, that is no reason to label them criminals. People do all kinds of things that could be harmful to their health, from swimming with sharks to climbing mountains, and we don't lock them up for it. We respect that it's their life and their health, and if they want to risk it, that's their business, and it doesn't make them criminals, except when it comes to drugs. Here, the individual's right to do whatever they wish with their own body and mind is dismissed out of hand, and the state claims the right to incarcerate and destroy the lives of drug users for their own good. Personally, I find it difficult to understand how the general public can accept such a blatantly self-contradictory position. Now, of course, there will always be those who abuse drugs. But, as with alcohol, the majority of those who consume drugs are drug users. Only a minority are drug abusers. In any other field, use is the opposite of abuse. But when it comes to drugs, the media routinely call all drug users drug abusers. This is like saying that everyone who drinks alcohol is an alcoholic. On the contrary, most people who use drugs are perfectly capable of using them responsibly and safely. Only a minority harm themselves with drugs. And for them, as with alcohol, the drugs are just a symptom. The real problem lies in the social problems and social pressures which have driven them to harm themselves. The war on drugs does nothing to address those social problems. The war on drugs provides power for politicians and money for the private prison corporations that incarcerate drug offenders. But it does far more harm than good for the general public. The health problems posed by drugs should be dealt with by the healthcare system, just like all health problems. They should have nothing to do with the criminal justice system. If the Canadian government was really concerned with improving the Canadian public's health, then it should take the $1 billion a year that it spends on the war on drugs and spend it on, say, health care, instead of on putting people in jail. Build clinics and detox centers instead of prisons. Hire doctors and therapists instead of police and prison guards. But that wouldn't make the rich and powerful richer and more powerful. And so the war on drugs continues. In recent years, however, the war on drugs finally seems to be breaking down under the weight of all of its lies. Opinion polls are showing that a majority of the Western public no longer believes most of the scare stories surrounding marijuana. In the 2015 federal election, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper said that marijuana is, quote, infinitely more dangerous than tobacco, and that he was therefore opposed to its legalization, I think most Canadians just saw it as more evidence that he was out of touch with today's social reality, and it contributed to his electoral defeat. As a result of changing public opinion, a number of countries have partly decriminalized drugs, especially marijuana, in the 21st century. These include Holland, Portugal, and Malta in Europe, several Latin American countries, and Canada, Mexico, and several US states in North America. In these places, marijuana has almost overnight become a legal, multi-billion-dollar industry. And the more money this industry has, the more pressure it can put on politicians to expand legalization. Their cause is aided by mounting mounting evidence that none of the dire consequences for society's health once predicted for legal marijuana have come to pass. In 2020, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police recommended decriminalization of possession of small amounts of all illegal drugs. Shortly after that, Vancouver City Council voted unanimously to ask the federal government for permission to do just that. In response, the federal government announced that, as of January 2023, the entire province of British Columbia would become exempt from federal drug possession laws, allowing possession of small quantities of all drugs without fear of criminal charges. It is expected that other provinces will soon follow suit. In addition, in 2021, the Liberals introduced Bill C-22, which doesn't quite decriminalize possession, but it does scrap mandatory minimum sentences, and it requires police and prosecutors to consider alternatives to laying criminal charges for simple possession. These alternatives can include referring the person to a treatment center, giving them a warning, or even taking no action at all. In reality, there is not, and never has been, a war on drugs. There is only a war on drug users. It's not drugs being put into prison, it's drug users. It's not drugs having their lives ruined by the state, it's drug users. While the media give the impression that the police focus on arresting drug dealers, in reality, close to 90% of arrests are for simple possession. Justifying this mass incarceration by wildly exaggerating the health risks of psychoactive drugs, and then telling drug users that they must be locked up for their own health in prison, which is one of the unhealthiest environments in society, is literally adding insult to injury. Drug users know from personal experience that the state's claims of the dangers of drugs can't be believed, so using them to justify incarceration is just a cruel joke. The state has literally put itself in the position of the abusive parent who beats their children, then tells them he's doing it for their own good. In social terms, for the last century, drug users have been just another oppressed minority. Over the course of that century, it's become socially unacceptable or politically incorrect to oppress minorities on grounds of ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. But oppression of drug users continues. Oppression of millions of people for the so-called crime of altering their own consciousness continues, even though they're harming no one except possibly themselves. In recent years, Canada's Liberal government has legalized marijuana, and it has also issued formal apologies to oppressed minorities, most notably Indigenous peoples, for the way they've been treated in the past. But no politician has yet put the two together. In other words, where is the state apology to stoners for a century of government persecution and incarceration? Where is the apology for a campaign of vilification around marijuana use, which the state now admits was always based on a tissue of lies? Where is the apology for the lives ruined, not by drugs, but by the war on drugs? Our government is not yet ready to make such an apology, but I believe that someday it will be. As we look back through history, we can see that for thousands of years, there were no laws anywhere against drug use. Then, in the late 19th century, such laws were passed and the war on drugs began. Today, in the early 21st century, those laws are being reversed, piece by piece, country by country. I believe that what we're seeing today is that the war on drugs is on the way out. The general public is turning against it, and it's starting to crumble under the weight of scientific evidence and international political pressure. This sea change may be hard to believe. For every one of us alive today, psychoactive drugs have been illegal for our whole lives. This is why this situation seems normal to us. But it's no such thing. On the contrary, to future historians, it will appear as a brief aberration of about a century and a half, as compared to thousands of years of past and future legal drug use. Indeed, I would argue that in the future, the war on drugs will be categorized as a campaign of mass government persecution, similar to the Inquisition and the Holocaust, and it will be viewed with similar horror. Today, we see the witch hunts of the Inquisition as a period of almost incomprehensible hysteria and madness, during which over 1 million innocent women were tortured and executed for having so-called magical powers which never existed outside of church propaganda. The war on drugs is just as much of a witch hunt as the Inquisition, based on a similar campaign of fictitious state propaganda. While it hasn't killed as many, it has imprisoned far more. In the future, I believe that people will have difficulty understanding how it could have been sustained on such a scale, given its many falsehoods and contradictions. Someday, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness through psychoactive drugs will be seen as a basic civil right. Today, the time has come for governments to stop ruining the lives of millions of people around the world for no good reason. Drug prohibition has failed, just as alcohol prohibition failed in the 1920s. The people have chosen booze and drugs over politicians and their laws. Or, to conclude with the words of one internet meme I recently saw, I'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs. That concludes what I have to say on the war on drugs. A transcript of this talk is available if you're interested. Good day, all.